Harvey,
Okay,
it's your show. I'm going to back out.
thank you, Matt. Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Brown Bagging It from My Backyard. This is a service of Nature in My Backyard, which again is a service of the Audubon Society of Greater Cleveland and Cuyahoga County Master Gardeners. I ask at the outset if you guys can mute your microphones. And also, it's probably good to turn off your video while we're doing this. And if you have questions, post them in the chat, and we'll get to them as at the conclusion of Chad's program. Just a couple things coming up next month. We've got an outstanding program. Amy Goletz from Avonlea Gardens and Inn, which is out there on Fowler's Mill Road in Geauga County. If not been to it, it's a fabulous native plant nursery. I mean, they've got great stuff. And she's going to be talking about shrubtastic and I think selecting and caring for native shrubs in your landscape. And then one other thing we pitched last time, the fact that on the 20th of September, the Master Gardeners of Cuyahoga County are having their fall seminar, and that fall seminar is a full day thing on the 20th from 8:15 to 3:30. It features as a keynote Ginger Woolridge, and if you remember, Ginger was our speaker back in June, and the co-author of this incredible book, Essential Native Trees and Shrubs of the Eastern United States. So that's a really cool thing. Jane had just informed me before we went live that it is in fact sold out, but they are looking for perhaps doing a digital version, some version to be able to access it. So if you wanted to do that, I would recommend that you reach out to Cuyahoga Master Gardeners at cuyahogamg.org and find out more information. Hey, Bill Shaw, if you're on, can you mute your mic?
So, welcome to the first.
Hey, well, we'll see if, I don't know, hey, Matt, do you have the ability to mute Bill? Thank you. Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get to the business of hand. We are really, really pleased to have Chad Clink as our speaker today. When we get into this whole thing about creating native habitats in our own backyard and the importance of doing that, both individually and collectively, Doug Tallamy, our guru, the savant, the catalyst, the organizer of Homegrown National Parks, always says if you can do just one thing, what's that one thing? Plant a tree, preferably an oak. And he says that, of course, because of all of the invertebrates that depend upon oaks. But, just to plant a tree, where do you start? What's the best plant for the habitat that you have or the conditions you have in your yard? Where do you source said tree? And then if you just think you dig a hole and put it in the ground and you're said and done, oh, no. That's the start of a lifelong relationship with the tree. And how do you nurture it and care for it so that you can be successful? And the best thing to do when you have all of these questions, of course, is to call Chad Clink. Now, Chad is commercial arborist representative and local manager at Bartlett Tree Experts, located out of their offices in Oakwood Village. And Chad's been fascinated with horticulture and silviculture and arboriculture, I think pretty much his whole life. He graduated from Kent State University, both with an associate's and a bachelor's degree in horticulture. And following his graduation, he worked across the country as an arborist and an urban forester. And we know the importance of urban forestry to restore, the sanctuaries and the habitats in the places where we reside most densely. He also earned a master's degree in natural resource management from the University of Idaho. He has been certified by the International Society of Arborists. So he's a board certified master arborist, and he's also an ASCA registered consulting arborist. And ASCA is?
That's American Society of Consulting Arborists.
There you go. Thank you. When you take a look at this, there's assumption that everyone knows what these acronyms stand for.
Yeah, acronym abuse, guilty.
Anyway, he's So he's also a municipal specialist and a tree risk assessment qualified with the ISA and an Ohio licensed commercial applicator. Um, in his bio from Bartlett, it says he is passionate about providing high quality tree and shrub care with a goal towards preservation. And he always enjoys putting his expertise to use, advising his clients about maintaining their landscape. When he's not doing this, though I suspect that trees are probably central to his family life as well, he has a wife and 4 sons between the ages of 4 and 9 and 2 German shepherds. So this is one busy man. And he is inclined to do a little recreational climbing from time to time. So we were asking if, he was outfitting his kids with spikes. I have since learned that we do not use spikes at all on any tree because of the harm they can inflict. And in the modern arboriculture, they've got a whole system borrowed from rock climbing that allows you to ascend and descend a tree without harming it. But he's got a setup in the backyard for his kids. So he's bringing about the next generation. So we are really, really excited to have Chad Clink, and his program is called Rooted for Success, Tree Planting Best Practices. Chad, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much for the awesome introduction. I really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen and hope that this all works good. So yeah, today we're talking about tree planting, which is hopefully timely for everyone in their backyards. If you're not thinking about tree planting seasonally, this is a great time for most species to get established in your backyard. So we were talking about migratory birds, go figure, earlier on, and there's some stretches there in spring and fall, and it's similar with trees here. Those are our 2 kind of peak windows for tree planting, where trees are ready for digging. Environmentally, the conditions can be much preferred as opposed to the middle of summer, where it's a little bit more temperate, maybe a little bit more rainfall, just a little bit more ease of use to get those new roots grown out in the landscape. So,
Probably the ones that got them right away.
What it looks like out in the field, balls and burlap trees. So this tree's just been dug by the nursery stage. You can see those fresh cut fruit and the goal is on bunch of that a very stressful point in the tree's life, where it's probably lost close to 70–80% of its root ball, if not more. And there's a good touch in there with that nursery spade to clear off that excess debris. And we'll learn more about that on the webinar today as to why that's important for exposing the root flare. And then from here, the folks are going to kind of clean up the edges and the loose roots and get that new tree wrapped in the basket and burlap and off to the races. So quick intro, you definitely want to make sure you get high quality stock. Reason being, tree planting takes a very small amount of time, but in the grand scheme, tree lives are very long. So do it right the first time or don't do it at all is the mantra. And it starts with making sure you have high quality nursery stock. Match the tree to the site. So you want to make sure that the soil is going to be viable for the type of root ball or root system that you have. Make sure the trees are free of pest or disease issues. I see often on landscapes where a tree will come in with a pest or disease issue, and then all of a sudden you've got 100 trees with the pest or disease issue from that scale insect or piercing sucking insect. And that is not fun to have to manage on the landscape. So kind of unintended consequences at times. And really what you want to focus on is making sure you have a good root ball. That root ball is kind of the workhorse, the mitochondria of the tree. So as the roots go, the top goes for sure. What we want to look for is any kind of circling or girdling roots. So this picture right here, you can see how that just dog legs right out of the tree and is wrapped around. So a lot of our nursery stock, even balled in burlap trees, like I just showed you, they actually start as containerized stock. So it'll be a tree in a container with the potting mix, and that containerized tree will actually go out into the field, be planted, and then harvested later as a balled and burlap tree.
that can lead to circling and girdling roots. So even when it's little teeny tiny in a little plug, so a 1 gallon container, about yay big, those roots can hit the side of that container and start to circle around. And it happens naturally too out in our landscapes. But I attribute a lot of these defects that we correct out in the landscape to, nursery production practices. And it's not anybody's fault. It's just a quality concern that we need to be hip to and aware of, so that when we are speccing and purchasing new trees, we're getting the best possible stock for our landscapes and for our communities, and avoiding a huge loss on investment. A lot of times these issues don't manifest themselves till 5, 10, 15 years down the road. So you have a great, perfectly healthy tree, and then all of a sudden you start to get decline in the top of the crown. You wonder what's going on. And oftentimes it's this mechanical issue here, because that circling and girdling root will start to cut into the trunk of the tree and restrict the flow of the nutrients in solution, the photosynthates, if you will, of the tree, and it'll cause a pretty sudden acute decline, which we don't want that at all. And you can see this kind of playing out in landscapes. This was a really beautiful fringe tree at the Arboretum, and it just never really took off, and no one ever really knew why. But you can see how high the soil was on there. I don't know if I have a marker on here, but that soil line went up on the trunk probably a good 6 inches over where that big girdling root is, and it was cut and severed. And what you'll also notice is it's often confused for sun scald or frost crack, but those little patches of dieback, you see that opening there right in the middle of the photo on the left, that pressure from that girdling root will cut off and kill that vascular tissue on the trunk. So I often see circling girdling roots misdiagnosed as sun scald or frost crack, but you start to poke around below ground and see some flat spots around the soil and the roots and the root collar and flare. Oftentimes it'll be linked to a large circling and girdling root that's applying a lot of pressure to the tree's trunk. And it's amazing when you cut these, the pop, it really gives you an idea of how much pressure it's applying to that tree's trunk and root system, and how damaging it can be to the plant. One way to check this in the nursery is to rotate the stem to see if there's a large air gap. That'll give you an indication as to how deep the tree is in that root ball. And I think industry standard says we want most of the first order roots, those roots that flare out in the first 2 to 4 inches of the soil. So you can actually use field pins to try and probe for this, but really it's about having a good relationship with the growers, understanding their process. Do they do root pruning? How frequently do they move the plants up into different size containers? And what's their focus on quality to their end user? And that's really helped me establish those positive relationships and dialogue back and forth to make sure we're getting the highest quality trees for our clients, our communities, and our own backyards too. Central leader can be important. This is probably more specific to large growing shade trees. If anyone's ever seen the aftermath of a storm and those trees that look like they split like a banana peel, this is a big reason why. We want to start that strong structure, as early on as possible in the plant, knowing that those branches on those large shade trees for the first probably 5 to 10 or 10 to 15 feet are eventually going to have to come off. They're temporary branches because they're likely to grow into the landscape or the right of way or into your house. But that stem, the main stem that runs up and down, is going to be there in perpetuity on the tree. And again, look for pest or disease issues. You want to make sure we're injury free, because this is, again, stressful time. So additional injuries to the trunk or broken branches, root collar, things like that, they can become very attractive to insects, even opportunistic diseases that can infect and colonize those areas too. Some different stock types, just so everyone's aware of options. Not a lot of folks do bare root, but I think it's great. Super light. You can see the entirety of the root system. I've done this on some larger scale kind of reforestation type plantings, order in a couple hundred or a couple thousand, depending on the scale, bare root whips, and put those right out into the landscape, even if they're small seedlings too. You just got to be careful. The timing of it's a little bit tricky. You don't want to do it when it's too hot. You definitely have to keep those roots wet or use some type of a hydrogel to keep that water stuck to those fine fibrous roots, but can be really effective. And again, there's an application for each of these. Containerized too, again, fairly light in nature. Probably great for most homeowners if you don't have heavy equipment to move a larger size root ball. One of the drawbacks is you've got potential, I think a higher potential for circling and girdling roots, and because the tree's growing in potting media, substrate. So they're going to be very happy in that, but if you don't break up that substrate and really find those roots and root flares and do some root pruning, you're probably likely to have circling and girdling roots in yours and the tree's future. And you can see that looking at the top of this container plant here. This was actually at the Holden Arboretum in their hoop house, and we were talking about production, tree production, and how to manage these. And really the key is that there is early and often root pruning on the plants and correction of those potentially circling and girdling roots so that as you're moving the tree up in size, you're keeping a healthy fibrous root system that's growing outward as opposed to wrapping around the main trunk. Ball and burlap, I would say, is probably our most common. It's fairly, most of the nurseries are set up that way, spring or fall. So you do get a soil-based root ball, which is great. It can hide some defects, as I mentioned earlier. If there's containerized stock in the middle of those, you still got to dig down. And also just general nursery practices with like tillage and the way the plants are harvested. A lot of those roots kind of get buried off the rip. So if you're not hyper vigilant and looking for it, you're going to have issues down the road where the trees are too deep. There was no basket removed and circling and girdling roots that were never corrected, which is it's kind of a shame because it's a big investment, New tree installed could be like $1,000. So to lose on that investment and to not have that tree appreciate and become an ecological asset in the landscape is sad. So we got to keep educating our nursery partners, our consumers, our landscape retailers, our landscape industry, just the green industry at large to help advocate for better quality stock and better installation for consumers as the end user here. Just for scale, you can see here with this soil knife that we utilize to excavate that root collar and root flare, there's good 5-6 inches, maybe even 7 or 8 if you include the handle on that soil knife shank. So you got to dig deep sometimes, but literally and physically, I guess, when you're planting these guys. So until you find that root flare and those first order roots, you haven't really fully done your job, and you don't really know how deep you need to plant, which we'll get into a little bit more here moving forward on how do you do this once you've considered your site and the nursery stock and have a good plan to move it forward. And just a little image here from we have what's great for our industry is we have a standard. So there is a best practice and standard through an accrediting body, American National Standards Institute, which specifies how trees should be grown, one, and then how they should be installed in the landscape too. So this is an example of a specialist installing a new tree. The only thing I don't like about this is I would like to have had the root collar excavated prior to it being in the ground, because you'll save yourself some work. There's really no reason to plant the tree without knowing the distance between the roots where they flare out in the root ball and the bottom of the planting hole. It can contribute to settling or potentially deep planting. In techniques, we want to be thoughtful about any process. So I would encourage everyone to make sure you know where your utilities are. They're intuitive above ground, but you want to know below ground, hey, where's gas? Where's electrical? Where is the storm and sanitary lines too? Because trees can definitely colonize those. And we don't want to perpetuate a perception that trees are a nuisance and liability. We want to make them assets in their community, but it's really important to take a balanced approach and consider the infrastructure in the conversation and the age-old adage of right tree, right place, which was started by the Arbor Day Foundation. So 811's your friend. We do it for all of our planting projects or any project that requires up to open the ground. And it's just the best and safest way to do it. So highly encourage, and also encourage to find the right height tree, especially if you are under electrical lines. That's a common issue across our market and landscapes, given the pole-to-pole electrical conduction. Someday we'll get to some alternative energy forms, but that's what we got for now, and we still need trees in the fray. a technique. Wanted to show you guys just the importance of a shallow and wide hole and a really strong base for the tree. So you can see that the planting hole has been dug kind of like a saucer, and there's a really firm base underneath the rooting portion of that root ball, and that's going to help prevent settling. And then there's a nice tilled media that's not too compacted or hard panned or impenetrable, so that those new roots can grow out into that soil and also be protected by this really nice mulch ring on top. So as it's irrigated, the water is going to go down right into that central stem and those first order roots, and then dissipate into the mulch and into the ground, and allow those trees to have a really healthy environment to grow in. Not too hot, not too cold, avoid unnecessary water loss, and keep the weeds suppressed with that nice thick layer of mulch. So shallow and wide is the goal once you've identified where that root flare is. And you want the distance of your planting hole to be the distance from the root flare, the top of these root flares right here, to the bottom of that root ball, give or take, even with grade. I'll give you a quarter to half inch either way, because we can't all be perfect. And every tree's different, every situation's different. Some examples of deep planting. So you can see here, this was an urban site in Cleveland, some inspections, some support, and mulch all the way up the trunk, looking more like a telephone pole than a tree. And then you can see really no attempt there on that photo to the right to remove any of the burlap or the wire. So really we're guessing here. We're guessing, and we're just planting at any depth and then kind of covering up with mulch as a veneer to cover our deficiencies. So this is common, and it's okay. That's why we're talking about it and why we're sharing with our community members and helping to hold the industry accountable and elevate each other. How about this one? Mulch volcano. We see it a lot. It's like the Mount Vesuvius of mulch volcanoes. So it doesn't hurt my feelings too bad because it's on a calorie pair for any of the native fans out there. There's a lot of non-native invasive pairs. So if a tree were to get volcano mulch, I guess this is the one. But this is not a practice that we promote or support, but it's unfortunately all too common. And some more images, corrected root collars. So tree to the right, that was buried at planting. We did a root collar excavation. You can actually see the mulch was staining the trunk there, that kind of dark brown, black color there, and then the soil that was on top of the flares. So we want those trunk flares to be just at grade to give the tree the best chance of survival, and maybe just a touch of mulch all the way around and about a fist wide out away from that trunk, so it has some room to breathe, but it's still protected. This is, if you've ever been up to the botanical garden, it's a beautiful tree that actually had root invigoration done and some root collar work done to help expose. And it was cool to see the aftermath. Fixing these little cultural things. This tree always kind of browned out and desiccated during the growing season. And after this intervention, mitigation of the situation, trees been amazing in terms of growth and development and resilience in the landscape. So this can be an upper edge for the plants. They have to focus a lot of energy into that root collar and root flare area. There's 2 to 4, sometimes 5 or 6 active layers of vascular tissue that's moving those nutrients from the roots, zooming up into the crown. And if they have to defend that area, if it's too wet or if it's covered, it robs a lot of resources from the tree. They're focusing that energy on defense versus growth or storage of carbohydrates, or obviously reproduction as well, and defense compounds too. So it's an important area to keep clear around your trees. And it's a tough balance because we want companion plants. We want the good guys out there for beneficials too, but we don't want to lose the tree in the process either. So it's a tightrope that we all have to walk. And just again, not to overtake, sometimes the root flares are shallow. So, we just peeled the back of this sweet gum, or sorry, black gum right here off, and that root flare is within the first half to quarter inch. So there's always going to be variability here, as I mentioned earlier. And you just need to read the tree and read the situation and make the right decision. And, yeah, be objective and have fun with the process. Planting materials too. I am in favor of stakes and ties, especially if you have a root ball that's really loose. But as the tree roots into the ground, we want to remove those to make sure that they don't girdle. Even the arbor tie We're not using garden hose or anything like that, or wire in a garden hose, but even the arbor tie, the flexible ties that go around the tree's trunk, they can girdle into the trunk if left untended. Trunk guards are great too, but again, the tree's going to grow, and those trunk guards can get embedded inside the trunk. It helps keep the deer off, and just trying to install these materials as low as possible and take as much of the non-root and soil material off that tree as possible. I think the industry standard says around a quarter to half of the wire basket and burlap. I would say as a practitioner, our goal is 100% to remove that material, but it's not always possible. If the root ball is falling apart or it's a tricky situation where you need to leave the tree, just at grade or finished grade isn't available yet. So just make a good judgment call. And correct those root defects. Here's an example of how they manifest themselves in the containers, and how a seemingly healthy tree could actually have a lot of defects just kind of ticking as time bombs. This was, I believe, a hornbeam at the Arboretum. It was doing really good. But if you can find these small circling and girdling roots early and correct them, it's much less stressful on the tree, and the tree's going to have a much better prognosis long term in the landscape and be sustained for a very long time. And that's kind of a reverse before and after. It's after before, but if you go right to left, before and then after. Excuse me. If anyone knows perch, this is a perched water table. So there was this thought that if you had a poorly drained soil, if you fill it with rocks in the bottom, it's going to get rid of the water. And sad to say, no, that doesn't happen. The water just kind of sits in that bottom of the hole and resides in those rocks. So if you have a drainage issue, you definitely want to correct that. Some trees are more tolerant than others. We were actually talking about that before the call, me and Matt. So you will have some species like dawn redwood, bald cypress, pin oaks, swamp white oak, black gums that are going to tolerate that super heavy, compacted, or poorly drained soil. But it is best for sensitive species that are prone to Phytophthora, dogwood comes to mind, taxus, even some oak species to an extent, to make sure that you have good and adequate drainage. Again, know your species, know your soil conditions for sure. Most importantly, know your plan for watering and maintenance. That's a big part of a successful tree planting. It's not just the planting, but the establishment after the fact. Again, 2 to 3 times the root ball. You want to incrementally underneath the side of that root ball, stabilize it, make it sure it's nice and straight, not going to rock around in the landscape, and marry together that parent soil with the root ball soil as well. So you get a nice, even, homogeneous kind of finished product there. Image on the right and image on the left to help illustrate that. And you can top dress that finished planting, successful planting, shallow and wide hole, root flare at grade. You can top dress those roots as they're coming out of the root ball with compost. What kind of compost will do? Wood chips as well. They can be fresh arborist chips. They can be slightly composted chips. Just a good natural wood chip. Avoid the palletized, dyed, and shredded types of mulch. Those are really difficult. They don't break down in the landscape over time. They can kind of create a water repellent or hydrophobic condition, getting big and chunky. So you just want to go all natural here with just a good natural compost, good natural wood chips, 2 to 4 inches on top of the tree. And it's nice to make a little bit of a berm in there too. That'll help trap the water and make filling up and watering the new tree much easier and less likely to have that water, which is a finite and precious resource, run off. So some pro tips there. And then over time with this approach, we're trying to grow that really healthy root system post-transplant. So from those root ball right there to incremental years, that's maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years of the plant growing out horizontally in the landscape and branching out where there's enough oxygen, and you'll have a tree that's well established in the landscape. And I think important to point out, if you weren't already aware, but many of you probably are, most of those roots, those fine fibrous roots, are going to be in the first 4 to 6 inches in most soils, or 6 to 8, maybe a foot, depending on if it's sandy or clay. But they're going to be looking for water. They're going to be looking for oxygen, organic material, and much of that is shallow in the soil. So again, it's great. Through this process, we have standards with the B&B trees. We're going to make sure those are root pruned and that they're hardened off prior to getting shipped out to the landscape, and that those root balls are protected so that they don't fall apart. Really cool process there of drum lacing, but most of our B&B trees are wire baskets with burlap wrapped around, which works really well. And some more industry standard stuff. So I mentioned ANSI. This is an example of the size of the root ball based on the caliper of the tree. So, for example, 1-inch caliper, which is essentially the diameter measured about 4 to 6 inches above grade. You want a 16-inch wide root ball, and you can see how it scales up. There's a relationship here of caliper to size of the root ball. I believe that's in diameter. So you want to make sure that when these trees are harvested, you're not harvesting or under harvesting the root system, because you will get tree failures where they just don't have enough root mass to survive the shock and stress of that transplant process. Tree spades are great. You got to take great care. You can even move very large trees this way with an adequately sized spade and a lot of good prep and care. And even large trees bear root, which really good friend of mine who recently passed away, Mark Henigman, actually pioneered in our market. Amazing arborist who's moved very large mature trees, bear root, and pioneered that whole process for the industry. So when we have a construction project or a large capital project and there's this heritage tree there, there are means and methods to help save those trees so they can be sustained in the landscape. There's a little example there of how to crane one onto the back of a truck, which is cool. If you've never seen this done, it's really an amazing process. And we'll kind of shift gears into care. That's the fun part. Everybody loves planting, and then it's like the hard work kind of begins. It's not just planting, but also establishment. So it starts early. Lots of water, 5 to 10 gallons per inch of caliper each week on the tree. So it's a pretty good commitment. And if you can install a gator bag or something that's going to allow that to dissipate into the root system slowly and not just run off, make it more plant available, that's great. You just got to stay close to it and measure the soil moisture. They do make some tools for that, like a tensiometer, but I'm a feel kind of guy. Did we get an inch of rain? Well, even if we got an inch of rain, we should probably check the soil and see if we could supplement the water a little bit. And that's probably the most important thing early on to get the trees through transplant shock. Some fertilization, there's not a lot of research that shows that like high nitrogen fertilization is going to help, but there are micronutrients that can help with root establishment. Phosphites, for example, which is potassium, they have been shown to induce defense in the plant and could potentially encourage more fibrous root systems from forming. Mulching is a no-brainer. We're trying to biomimic what's going on in the landscape naturally in our woods. So all that forest duff and those wood chips and that organic material and those humates, we like to include those in the fertilization program and make sure that the trees' new root balls are getting covered to keep that root ball moist and weeds down. And then staking or guying, do that case by case. Not all plants will need it. The heavier and larger the tree, probably the less likely they'll need it, but you can put stakes around the tree's trunk and adhere that to like an arbor tie, a flexible band, and some arborist knots. Or this is kind of cool from the recent edition of the standards. They're actually doing this below ground in a way that will allow for those 2x2s to just disintegrate. And with the root ball, I guess the only concern there is how you attach those if you're using screws or something biodegradable or some wood glue. But this is kind of the innovative approach of looking at securing that root ball versus the trunk and not having to come back or worry about it being girdled. Because we do see that in the landscape pretty often, the wires inside of the garden hose and trying to save some trees, as it will girdle them and can cause some pretty serious crown decline or death. This is kind of a cool chain style. This is out in front of the Arboretum on their Miyabi maples, which those are probably much bigger now than they were 10 years ago, which is great. They know what they're doing. So that's an option too, that kind of a gridlocked style of tie, or even an arbor tie too. The root guards are huge too. The dreaded mower blight, if you will, or even some small mammals, varmints that will want to come up and chew on the trunk, or even larger mammals like our deer that will want to rub right now with the rut or knock a whole tree over. Had a text message on my phone this morning from a rogue buck over in University Circle. So, these things happen, they're real, or you go so far as to include deer protection too, fencing in around the tree. But all these little touches are going to help improve your success in transplant and establishment in the landscape. Some examples over at the metro parks for young trees where there's high deer pressure, just fencing in that whole area. And really, that's probably just barely enough too. That fence could probably be 6 to 8 to 10 feet tall, but we got to be realistic too. Pruning, not a lot of pruning early on. So you want to have trees that already have good structure. If you have a serious defect, like we do here on this red maple, 2 codominant stems right there at the top of the tree, it's okay to correct that, because who knows when someone's going to be back to tree trainer, take care of that issue and what that could turn into and what it's going to look like 20, 30 years from now. And then all of a sudden, this beautiful shade tree's on the ground because we never made that little tiny pruning cut at planting. Now, don't go nuts, because those leaves are really important for all those roots to recover. It's going to work hand in hand. The crown, the leaves, they're going to be the workhorses and then create those photosynthetes to help nourish the roots and allow those roots to reestablish. And then anything aesthetic, dead, broken branches like that, you want to make sure it's a good finished product for your client or your landscape. Some examples of quick little corrective cuts. We've got these large upright branches on the left that long term are going to be a problem. If you're taking less than 10% of that tree's live tissue, you're going to be all right. So for us practitioners, ANSI A300 is really good. If you're interacting with a contractor, they should be aware of these. So it's a good question to ask for our consumers out there to make sure that we're meeting, or at least in our instance, we're trying to exceed these standards to help make for a better product in our communities. And here's a good detailed drawing. If we talk about details or specifications, especially on larger projects, you want to point to a good detail and spec that really clearly spells out that we're meeting or exceeding all these industry standards for the type of stock, its quality, how the root ball is going to be handled, how the tree is going to be planted, any kind of modified soil or amendments that need to go into the ground, how the tree is going to be mulched, watered, and then any kind of establishment or maintenance program too. Show you a little video here. Hope this will work for you. Oops. This is up at Gordon Park. Have some volunteers that are working to unwrap that root ball, find that root flare. And this is just how fast they work, I promise. Checked in there for like half a second. So they found that root flare, figured out that planting depth, rolled this new ball cypress into the ground, and then made sure there's a good drink of water and a nice burn, and I call that 20 seconds to treat. So if only it was that easy, right guys? And that's everything I have for you. So that's me. Appreciate you having me on today, and certainly open to any questions y'all might have.
Thanks, Chad. It is fascinating stuff. You packed so much information. It's interesting, the term, I think I first heard the term volcano mulching, I don't know, about 4 or 5 years ago. And then once somebody points it out to you, you find out that everyone does it. I mean, it's like seems to be a common practice, whether it's folks that just don't have the training or experience, or whether it's homeowners or what, but it's kind of like, oh yeah, we want to just pile it up against the trunk, not realizing that you're actually choking off the tree.
Yeah, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I call it, I joke with my friends and family, I call it the burden. Once you're an arborist, you have the burden. You see the world in a much different way, but you got to do something about it and share it and help educate people, as I mentioned in the presentation. It's
Yeah, I got some questions. I don't see too many questions in the chat, but I have some personal questions for you. And that is the overall concern that a lot of us old fogies have for the integrity of our forests, and we've been assaulted with so many. I grew up as one of that generation that, look what happens with the chestnut blight, and we lost the American chestnut tree. Look what happened to our precious elm trees growing up in Shaker Heights. I remember being out front playing softball in the front yard as the DDT sprayers went down Shelburne Road, and we're getting the mist on it. And it was kind of like, and you go off to college and you take these courses in ecology. Well, we've obviously learned our lesson there, and we'll never let that happen again. And now we find that, with oak wilt, and beech leaf disease and emerald ash borer and woolly adelgid. The list goes on and on and on. And the integrity of our native trees, it just seems like that they're under assault. When you're making recommendations of species of trees, does that factor into it, or are there ways, if you like if you wanted to plant an American beech, are there ways to protect it?
Yeah, definitely. There are means to protect beech. We've done a lot of great research in the last 10 years to identify what was causing beech leaf disease, and we identified that it was a non-native nematode, actually from Japan in origin, that likely came over in some type of beech stock, kind of epicenter of Lake Erie, Canada, Lake County, Northeast Ohio. So there are foliar applications of nematicides. You got to be hyper vigilant there from the ecology perspective, right? Because we don't want to damage any of those macro and micro invertebrates that are vulnerable from those types of chemical applications. But I think what's the most promising, especially on the large trees, is the root flare injections, similar to Dutch elm disease treatments, as you mentioned earlier. So those were pioneered in the 70s and 80s, but it's the same active ingredient for Dutch elm disease, and it is all injected via macro infusion, where we actually drill into the tree's root flare and pump up via pressure in the tree's natural turgor to draw that product in water. And that protects the tree from the nematodes, which is quite amazing. We've seen trees that were 80, 90% infested, under distress, turn around within a season and be protected for 2 years. And that was published actually in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, which is great to see. And we had some trial studies actually right here in Northeast Ohio. So it was cool to contribute to that. So that's kind of one fragment of your question, but to the broader question, yeah, we have to really consider not just the right now in the way of our hardiness zones, but what our hardiness zones going to look like in 50 to 100 years. There is a great tool from the Forest Service, the Climate Change Tree Atlas. So it's going to give you projections of which species are likely to kind of win or lose over the next 50 or 100 years based on different emission scenarios. And then I think local knowledge, what species work on what soils and types, so you can create the optimum growing conditions for those trees and those environments. Because there's a lot we can do to increase the adaptive capacity of the trees and those cultivars that are our proven winners in the landscape. But it might take a little bit of extra supplemental care from us to help make that happen.
There's a flip side to that question, and coming back to the beech, because John Pagashnik, who is a naturalist and natural resource specialist for Lake Metro Parks, is the one that identified it. And one of the thoughts was, why would it appear of all places in a Lake Metro Park? And then pointed out, well, we have this thriving nursery business all around it, where we in fact bring in exotic trees and plants for the landscape. So it comes back to that whole idea of, if we can, we really should be planting native stuff in our landscape, and then we wouldn't be driving the business maybe of bringing in stuff that potentially has got pathogens or parasites or diseases.
It's a tough one. I mean, we're dealing with the global economy, and it's a big boulder that's really hard to stop, and you kind of feel like Sisyphus rolling it up the hill every time there's another problem, trying to solve it. So I think as much biodiversity as you can implement and diversity in your plantings, the better. That's going to create a more resilient and more ecologically and biodiverse community for all of our pollinators, all of our beneficial insects, our avian friends, just the whole system. So we've found in a lot of our research that the more biodiverse the landscape is, the less likely you are to have pest disease issues in the first place. So, no more monocultures out there. I think we learned that with emerald ash borer and ash trees. We certainly saw it with Dutch elm disease and elms, and even chestnut blight. So as humans, maybe it's like 3 or 4 times before we learn our lesson, but I hope we have in terms of no monocultures and promoting biodiversity and just diversity in planting plans.
I'll give a shout out to my former employer. If you go to the Clink Museum of Natural History and you go out into the Ralph Perkins II Wildlife Center and Woods Garden presented by Key Bank, I can't not do the whole thing, under the towering black oaks and some of the beautiful sort of legacy trees that have been there. it was certified as a site for American chestnut, blight-resistant American chestnut, and there's probably, I don't know, maybe 20 saplings. And every time I go there, I mean, they're getting bigger and bigger, and it's really gratifying to see that.
Definitely. I
Because,
think
you
it's
know,
one we need to check on, Harvey.
yeah,
We need to check on down there.
yeah.
But we will.
So another question that comes to mind then. Okay, let's say you're a nature in my backyard person, and you're taking a look at your landscape, and well, maybe this is a question that Kathy has. When planting multiple trees, can you speak about how far apart they should be, similar and different species? But I guess my question, in addition to that, is, you know, if I take a look at just beyond my property line, I'm not too far from the bank of the East Branch Chagrin River, and there's a beech maple forest there. So if I was trying to, you know, recreate, so, you know, plant some trees, would, knowing that this was that habitat, is there some synergy with, you know, having those particular species there? Thinking, I mean, the beech tree, given its issues, maybe that's not the best example, but yeah, can you speak to both of those things about distance between trees, and then the idea of what species might you kind of bundle in a landscape?
Sure. Yeah, it's really going to depend on the site application and the goals of the woodland owner or the tree owner. So, you know, if we're thinking like a back lot in Shaker Heights where we're trying to promote biodiversity, we might have to pack a little bit more in, you know, and kind of layer that effect. Where in a woodland, that's probably going to be more of a scaling and kind of linear spacing if it's true forest restoration, or even if it's woodland timber production. So it's going to be highly variable. I will say you want to give at least enough space so that the crowns over time are going to maybe fill in and just barely touch, and then create some crown shyness. But you don't want to create it where you're going to have immediate conflicts in, say, like the first 5, 10, 15 years, or even down the line. So knowing the mature size of the species or the multiple species that you're using and how you're able to layer them in around each other in the existing infrastructure is an art form. So I can't give a really great, like, hard and fast answer as much as I would like to, but it's very nuanced. There's some artistry involved, and there's some landscape architects that do it a lot better than me.
Another question that I guess it relates to that, you know, again, when I think about the forests of my youth, when we had, let's see, you know, maybe 10,000 deer in the state of Ohio, not, you know, whatever we have now, 750,000, whatever it is. And thinking about, as you walked through the forest, there would be always these, you know, in the understory, these would be saplings, you know, and some of them could be really old trees that are just waiting for one of the big boys to finally knock off. And then there's that competition with those things that are there, you know, who can claim that canopy space. And then you know, the whole dictum that when you see one of these trees with a perfectly straight trunk, well, a tulip does that anyway, but anyway, any other species, it's because they were shooting towards the that open sky, and they couldn't afford any kind of wiggle room. That whole idea of having lots of saplings and let them fight it out is not a good one. You don't recommend it?
No, not on your own landscape if the goal is, you know, biodiversity and maturity of those trees, because those kind of linear, tightly planted, you know, 4 to 5 or 5 to 10 feet type row croppings, that's typically for timber production. So it's okay, you know, I mean, if that's the goal of the woodland, a timber stand harvest at some point in the woodland and keeping it in conservation and doing it sustainably, fully supportive. But you don't want to run into a situation where all of a sudden the backyard that you planted 20, 30 years ago, you have trees on top of each other that are choking each other out or causing structural issues by any means.
Got it. Jane asked about, what about creating a grove of all the same species like blackberry?
You know, like we talked about earlier, you want to avoid monocultures. So it's better to have a more diverse stand just in case something comes along that's going to knock out all your black cherries. But if it is for timber production, and black cherry is definitely desirable wood, you can grow them together. That's more of a traditional forestry application, so I don't delve into that a ton. But there's some good resources through the state. You know, we have our state extension foresters, and we have a great Ohio forest tax credit law program, which gives you CAUV status, 10 acres or more of contiguous woodland, and there's some Ohio tree farm systems too, which are great. So if the end goal is kind of crop production, that's one way to approach it, and groving with desirable species, black walnut, black cherry, oak, that's viable for sure.
Kathy asks, what is the best way to handle a root ball that is too overgrown with roots winding around each other when planting?
It's a good one. I have struggled with this for years, but where I found success is utilizing a tool called the air spade. So we take compressed air and we actually run it through this really long wand with a nozzle on the end. And this was pioneered to find utilities and underground digs. So we'll use that, wet the root bar, the container, and then use that air spade to actually dissipate all that soil or container media. And then you have an opportunity to kind of slice the outer layer of that root ball and correct any circling and girdling roots, or even make some slices into that root ball and give that tree a chance. I think there's a good, and this is not meant to be a shameless plug, so don't take it this way, but if you're on Facebook, check out our Facebook page, because we just actually had a post on this. It was very timely, and we did before and afters with the air spade, showing that process with the container plant before and then the container plant after it was corrected, which was just, again, good education for the community.
So if someone went to Facebook, they're looking up Bartlett tree.
Yeah, Bartlett Tree Experts Cleveland, I want to say, and you can find a picture of that really cool process. I did that with my teammate Jeff. I was like, Jeff, I think this would be a really good social media post. What do you think, man? He was like, let's do it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Peter asked the question, is there a resource for selecting native trees? I have an ash tree planted by the city that was infested by emerald ash borer. It was suffering from girdling as well. The city arborist cut the girdling root pop, and it seems to be growing with great increase in circumference and healing.
Nice. Yeah.
I don't know if there's a question there other than a resource for selecting native trees.
Yeah, Holden has a great one. Holden Arboretum. They have a tree species selection guide. So I would encourage you to check out, their website and work through that, which it goes into a lot more depth in terms of like what we talked about today, tree selection, planting considerations, but there is an appendix, a list in there that has both native and some non-native cultivars that the Arboretum has grown over the years that have been successful in our hardiness zone. So I would encourage looking there as a starting point.
Turning your attention to urban forestry. So
yeah,
like, thinking about the forest city and the fact that the city of Cleveland's got, I think, less than 30% of its original, forest canopy. How is the decision-making about the species used there? Is there a big effort to actually use native trees in that reforestation effort?
Yeah, there's a great program, Healthy Urban Tree Canopy Program, which has been funded by the county, now administered by Cuyahoga Soil and Water. And there is a question on there about, is the planting native or not? Now, I can't say it gets you brownie points one way or another through that granting process, but as much as we can promote native species on our project sites, we will. The challenge sometimes is in very disturbed sites where, say, a native species might struggle, and you might need to use a cultivated type of non-native, non-invasive plant. We get into some cool applications too with phytoremediation as well. Soils that are polluted with lead and doing bioremediation, and it's been great to see because we've actually used poplars, cottonwoods, willows, which maybe not as desirable natives, but still natives. So there's always a solution. You just have to get creative sometimes.
And then your thoughts about, we had Dave Tomaszewski from Meta City Nursery give his program on soft landings, which is fabulous, and that whole idea that, hey, Doug Ptolemy's encouraged you to plant this native tree, and yet now you've got grass growing right up to the trunk and you're mowing it all down. And the fact of the matter is all those invertebrates need a place to land, and they're going to overwinter in the leaf litter and the duff, and you've just removed it all. Do you guys have a recipe of, what should you respect the drip zone of a tree, and then, I loved your plug about using, real wood chips, go au naturel, great line, and not use palletized, dyed and commercial stuff, because I've seen that, and how it forms that hard pan. But, that whole approach to how which it really is important for us in terms of creating habitat for our native species, is that we want to promote all of these things. So what's your formula there? How large should that space be around the base of the tree that you want to try and have, its own leaves and leaf litter and duff on it?
Yeah, I kind of joke with clients. I'm like, so we should mulch this tree, and I kind of wait and see how they respond, and then wait for their reaction. Maybe it's like a foot or two away from the tree, and then I start walking, and I walk all the way out to the edge of the branches on the tree, the side branches. And I say, how about we start here? And they say, what? All the way out there? I'm like, well, yeah, the roots are out here. And so I'm like, all right, let's start walking towards each other. And then you tell me what's going to work aesthetically in your landscape. So I would say as far and as much as possible, the mulch on those trees, because the roots grow well out beyond where those branches are. But practically, even a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, I think small trees, 2 to 3 feet, medium size trees in terms of height, 4 to 5 feet, 6 or more on our large trees. But the more mulch, the better, just spread farther away from the tree as opposed to volcanoed on top.
Okay, I've been remiss. I've skipped a couple questions here. One question is, what trees or large shrubs are good traffic noise blockers?
Year round, it's going to be your conifers. So any kind of conifer, I guess green giant arborvitae has become super popular, but there are great natives like juniper, emerald sentinel. Juniper is awesome, especially if you're trying to get those cedar waxwings going on the property. So those are two that come to mind straight away, but those are going to be anything that's really dense and lush are going to be your best in terms of mitigating that kind of light and noise pollution.
And then Judy asks, can you give recommendations on how to prepare a compacted tree lawn site for planting?
Yeah, so great resource from Cornell Lab. I'm not going to pretend it's mine, but Nina Bassick kind of pioneered the scoop and dump process. So scooping and dumping compost at a certain specified volume and amount over that new planting site, and then top dressing it with compost and wood chips and letting it sit with any amendments for like 3 to 6 months. And that's going to stimulate all those microorganisms, help suppress that turf, definitely strip the turf and get the turf out of there, because those rhizomes will try to reinfest that area. But as soon as you can get the tree planted and mulch, I've seen really good success with that scoop and dump process.
Scoop and dump, I like it.
Yep.
And then Kathy asks, is planting of many shade plants under a tree harmful for a tree?
Not necessarily, as long as you're careful. If you're digging deep and starting to nick roots, that can cause some issues. What we worry about is the companion plants starting to obscure or climb up on the trunk or cover the root collars and flares to where we're not detecting an issue or irrigating in a way that's causing some root rot or disease around the tree. So it's just about doing it delicately and really keeping the tree clear of anything that could obscure.
So part of the moral of the story is being able to see that root flare is important.
Definitely. And the trunk, if vines grow up it or ground cover starts to obscure those flares, you could miss root rot or decay or a mushroom that could be causing an internal issue where the tree is structurally concerned. It could fall down.
So speaking of vines, we used to always think that, grapevine was bad. And of course, if grapevine totally engulfs your tree, I guess it is bad. However, then we also found that grapevines are very important for wildlife and for creating patches out in big habitat. But if you have creeper on a tree, or if you have poison ivy on a tree, and the tree is, it's on your border, and you don't really care about your neighbors, and you know that the birds are going to be feasting on the berries in the fall. Are they potentially damaging to the trees?
Not until it gets to the point where the vines are starting to crush into the vascular tissue. So I've seen it with English ivy, at least, where the ivy will start to kind of impinge into the vascular system of the tree. But small vines, poison ivy, Virginia creeper, so long as you're managing that, and it's not in a situation where it could cause a problem down the road, like back 9, corner lot, whatever it might be. You just want to be hyper vigilant around structures, people, things like that, to make sure that the tree is safe and not harboring.
Yeah. Well, and English ivy is on our no list. That's the first thing we try and attack when we're recommending to folks, if you get that off the landscape.
That one's the most problematic, but that's like in my yard, I have Virginia creeper and poison ivy vines growing up some of my trees, but I do it with intent, knowing that it's a non-issue to the property's safety or health. So,
And colors are beautiful. And
Oh,
again, you know, there's nothing more fun, at least I always enjoyed watching pileated woodpeckers dangling from little poison ivy twigs to get at those berries. And you're like, what? Dude, did you read your job description? You know, you're supposed to be eating carpenter ants, but it's just
impressive.
hilarious.
Yeah, impressive little acrobats for sure.
Yeah. So Kathy actually said, so allowing Virginia creeper is okay for tree bark.
I have not seen it damage tree bark. I would just again emphasize that you don't want it to get to a point where it obscures the trunk or the root collars in a way where you couldn't catch a crack or a defect or something that can cause the tree to fail.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, we've hit the 1 o'clock hour. Chad, this has been a fabulous presentation. Thanks for all this Q&A. You are a gold mine. And, you know, if anybody wants to enlist the services, you know, you can call Chad at Bartlett Tree Experts and get the real deal. But I think we've got a really good sense of what we should be doing to, number one, select the right tree for the right spot, and then our lifelong obligation to keep it healthy.
Yeah, we're the stewards of the environment. I really appreciate you guys having me out today and hope you can take the good information and share it out in your communities.
Thanks, cool. Just a reminder again that next month for Brown Bagging It From My Backyard, it'll be Amy Goletz from Avonlea Gardens and Inn out in Geauga County on Shrub-tastic. So we go from trees to shrubs in our effort to create native landscapes in our own backyard. Thanks for joining us.
And there was a lot of information presented here. This has been recorded, so you can check back with info@clevelandautobahn.org or Nature in My Backyard for how to link into the recording if you want to go through it again or speed through it to get to a certain section.
Awesome.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Chad. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you next month.
Have a great day, guys.